Okay, so think about ancient Rome. The Colosseum, emperors, legions. It feels like we know it inside out.
Those iconic images.
Right. But here's the thing. When you look at Rome's actual beginnings, that really early archaic period, our solid understanding, like the stuff based on scientific digging,
It's surprisingly limited.
shockingly limited. We're basically talking about a few small spots, little bits of the Forum, one area on the Capitoline Hill,
A sanctuary down by the Tiber, San Tomo Bono.
and yeah, three sections on the Palatine. It's not a lot of ground for such a huge story, is it?
It really isn't. And what's fascinating is how that very patchy physical evidence sits alongside the big sweeping stories we often hear.
The ones from later writers like Livy or Dionysius.
Exactly. Narratives written centuries after the fact.
Yeah.
It makes you really question, well, what are we basing our picture of earliest Rome on?
Precisely. And that's what we want to get into today. We're diving deep into how Roman architecture actually started in that archaic period.
But focusing on what the ground tells us, the archaeology.
Yes, the material evidence, the stuff they dug up, rather than relying solely on those later texts, which, might have their own agendas.
And we're drawing on the actual finds, but also some really insightful recent scholarship that tries to put early Rome in its proper place
Which is?
within the wider Mediterranean world it was clearly interacting with, not treating it in isolation.
Okay, so our mission, if you like, is to figure out what these early foundations, these bits of buildings and walls, tell us about how Rome actually developed as a city.
What do they reveal about its connections? With Etruscans, Greeks, others.
And maybe the most interesting part, how does this physical evidence sometimes challenge or maybe even contradict the traditional stories we've all heard?
Yeah, that's the core of it.
And for you listening, the goal is to get those key insights, the stuff that really shifts your understanding without getting bogged down. We want to pull out what matters.
Respecting your time, but giving you the real substance.
Exactly. So let's start with that limited evidence. Why is it so limited? Why only those few spots?
Well, it's a good question. A lot of it comes down to how Rome developed later. Those key areas you mentioned, the Forum, the Palatine.
Yeah.
They saw huge excavation campaigns, mostly in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. They literally cleared away later buildings to get down to the ancient levels.
Ah, so they were almost treated like archaeological preserves relatively early on.
In a way, yes. Say around the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline. But think about the rest of the Velabrum Valley, most of the Esquiline, the Quirinal, the Aventine. They're covered by medieval buildings, Renaissance buildings, modern Rome.
Just layers upon layers.
Right, especially with the big building booms in the 19th century and the early 20th under Mussolini. Getting down to archaic levels usually means tiny, expensive, exploratory digs, if it's possible at all.
And it's not just the buildings on top, is it? There's the water issue, too.
That's a huge factor, especially in the valleys, areas near the river, like around the Circus Maximus. The water table is much higher now than it was in antiquity.
So digging deep just means hitting water.
Pretty much. It makes large-scale excavation incredibly difficult or impossible. Even at San Tomo Bono, which isn't the lowest point, they needed serious engineering just to pump out water and keep the site workable.
Okay, so it really is like having just a few pieces of a massive jigsaw puzzle. And many of the other pieces are either hidden under later layers or while underwater.
That's a good analogy.
Which means, and this seems crucial, the picture we do get could be skewed, right? Just because we find a lot in the Forum doesn't mean the Forum was the only important place back then.
Absolutely critical point. The archaic city was definitely bigger than just those excavated zones. Our view is inevitably shaped by where we can dig.
So while the finds from the Forum, Palatine and Capitoline are amazing and have totally changed our understanding.
And they absolutely have. They're invaluable.
We have to be careful not to just, patch them together with potentially unreliable later stories and call it a complete picture.
Exactly. That combination of limited physical evidence and problematic texts, it requires a lot of caution.
Okay, so if the texts are often late or scarce for this very early period, how do we understand what was going on? You mentioned focusing on the objects themselves.
Yes, that's been a major shift. For much of the archaic period, we don't have written records telling us who built what, who lived where, the names of patrons, designers.
Yeah.
Even the original names of landmarks are often lost.
So the artifacts have to speak for themselves.
In a sense, yes. We look at the pottery, the bits of architecture, the early inscriptions we do find, not just as things mentioned in later histories, but as primary evidence.
Evidence of what?
Evidence of how they were made, the techniques used, their function, and crucially, the cultural interactions they represent. Who were the makers influenced by? Where did the styles come from?
So the object itself tells a story about its context and connections, separate from any later narrative.
Precisely. And when we do that, when we look closely at the ceramics, the inscriptions, even very early on, we see this mix. Latin elements, Etruscan elements, Greek influences.
Already blended together.
Yes. The material culture itself shows this mixing was happening from a very early stage. It wasn't some isolated, purely Latin community at the start.
That leads perfectly into this idea of connectivity, because for a long time, early Rome studies were a bit isolated, weren't they, academically speaking?
Very much so. There were disciplinary divides, between classical archaeology, Etruscology, Roman history.
Different fields, different conferences, different journals.
Right. And sometimes, let's be honest, certain prejudices crept in. Maybe a reluctance to see early Rome as sophisticated, or conversely, an attempt to make it uniquely Roman right from the beginning, disconnected from its neighbors.
And like drawing artificial lines on the ancient map.
Kind of, yeah. But thankfully, that's changed a lot, especially since the 1970s. We've had major discoveries in Etruria and really significant new finds in Rome and Latium itself.
Which showed what?
A much more interconnected picture. The old model of, say, powerful Etruscan cities just culturally dominating a backward Latium that's largely gone.
Replaced
by models that emphasize interaction between comparable entities, what we often call peer polity interaction.
Okay, so not just top-down influence, but neighbors influencing each other.
Exactly. Think of it as a network of developing city-states in central Italy, Rome, Veii, Caere, Gabii, Praeneste, all engaging with each other. Trading, competing, sharing ideas, sometimes fighting.
A much more dynamic scene.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And by the 8th century BCE, you see shared trends popping up across the region. Things like rich warrior graves.
Showing an emerging elite.
Yes. And then princely tombs, the adoption of writing systems adapted from Greek colonists, the first steps towards building temples, organizing urban spaces. These are happening in multiple places, not just radiating from one source.
Can you give some specific examples? Like where did certain ideas, maybe architectural ones, seem to start and spread?
Sure. So for instance, the earliest really widespread production of terracotta roof tiles, that seems to be centered in Etruria at sites like Merlo and Aquarasa. That technology takes off there first.
Yeah.
But then other things like the recessed gable, where the triangular pediment is set back slightly, and the idea of putting temples on high platforms or podia with steps only at the front.
Yeah. Where do they show up?
Those features appear earliest and are most common initially in northern Campania and the Latium, which includes Rome.
Huh. So different regions are innovating in different ways. It's not just Etruria teaching Rome everything.
Not at all. It's a two-way or maybe multi-way street. Ideas are flowing around. And it's crucial to understand, when Rome adopts terracotta roofing or when Etruscan cities start using podia, it doesn't automatically mean one culture is superior or dominant.
It just means they're interacting, seeing what neighbors are doing, maybe hiring craftspeople.
Exactly. The exchange likely happened between specific cities and probably through the movement of individual artisans and elite networks who cross these supposed cultural boundaries all the time. The old idea of one culture bestowing its gifts on another, it's just too simplistic.
Okay, that paints a way more interesting picture of early Italy.
Right.
So with that interconnectedness as the backdrop, how did Rome itself start to physically take shape? What's the earliest evidence on the ground?
Well, the archaeology points to scattered settlements starting on those famous hills, Palatine, Capitoline, Esquiline, Quirinal, Velia.
And what do we find? Hut outlines.
Pretty much. We find post holes, which show where timber posts for huts stood. Fragments of daub, that's the clay and straw mixture used for walls. We find seeds, ancient plow marks or furrows suggesting farming.
Okay, basic settlement stuff.
Right. And wells, often filled with discarded domestic pottery and other waste, which tells us people were living nearby. And importantly, graves, both cremation urns and inhumation burials.
Which implies more established communities,
Right.
right? Defined places for the living and the dead.
Exactly. And by the late 9th, early 8th centuries BCE, so quite early, we see signs that these scattered settlements are starting to coalesce, to cluster together. This is called nucleation.
The villages are growing into something bigger.
Something like that. We see, for example, clusters of wells with household rubbish on the Velia, suggesting a concentrated settlement. And cemeteries appear at the foot of the hills and on the Esquiline and Quirinal, suggesting organized communities with designated burial grounds.
So these hilltop villages are starting to maybe see themselves as connected. But it wasn't just huts and graves, right? You mentioned infrastructure earlier. Were they undertaking bigger projects?
It seems so. There's evidence for early efforts to manage water in the valleys between the hills, basically digging canals or drainage channels.
How early are we talking?
Well, the exact dating of Rome's very earliest drains is still debated, but we know that elsewhere in Italy, by the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, communities were building quite substantial drainage systems. Some canals were over 3 meters wide and 2.5 meters deep.
Wow. Okay, so the know-how was definitely around in the region.
The technology and the ability to organize that kind of labor existed.
And the biggest example of that kind of project in early Rome has to be the Forum, right? Dealing with that marshy valley.
Absolutely. The draining and landfilling of the Forum Basin was a massive undertaking. It fundamentally changed the landscape.
Turning swampy ground into usable central space.
Precisely. And that act itself, that huge communal effort, it likely played a massive role in bringing those hilltop settlements together. They had to cooperate on this long-term project.
You can imagine how working together to literally create a shared center would foster a sense of unity.
It must have. Once drained, the Forum Plain becomes the natural heart of the coalescing city, a place for markets, meetings, religious activity, driving further unification.
It's almost like the physical act of building the Forum built the early Roman community in a way. Okay, so the city is coalescing, they're managing the landscape. What about more outward-looking signs, monumental buildings, international connections?
For that, the sanctuary of Santo Mobono down by the Tiber is incredibly important. Excavations there really provide some of our best evidence for international contact and trade.
Because of what was found there.
Yes. By the early 6th century BCE, we find a really high concentration of foreign materials, particularly imported Greek pottery. Far more than you typically find in a purely domestic context.
Which suggests?
Its location near the river, the main trade artery, suggests it functioned as a kind of port sanctuary, a place facilitating contact, trade, exchange between Romans and outsiders, Greeks, Phoenicians, Etruscans.
A safe, neutral ground for interaction?
Possibly.
Yeah.
Some scholars argue these kinds of sanctuaries, sometimes with deliberately ambiguous dedications, were designed to be inclusive spaces, places where different peoples could worship and interact, fostering these international links. The mix of votive offerings found at similar sites supports this idea.
And the temple itself at Santo Mobono would have been a statement, right? Visible to people coming up the river.
Definitely. A prominent marker for the growing city, decorated with internationally influenced sculpture.
Okay, let's talk about those decorations. The terracottas found on early Roman buildings, you mentioned them being important indicators.
Hugely important. The decorative terracotta plaques and figures found at Santo Mobono and also at the Regia in the Forum show this amazing fusion of styles.
Fusion of what?
You see artistic ideas and specific motifs that are clearly inspired by trends across the Mediterranean, especially from Corinthian pottery and Greek art more broadly.
But it's not just copying.
No, and that's the key point. It seems to reflect Roman agency. They were just passively receiving these styles. They were actively selecting, adapting, and integrating them into their own architectural traditions for their own purposes, making them Roman.
Can you give an example from Santo Mobono? What kind of images are we talking about?
Sure. The sculptures decorating the roof, likely the pediment, included things like felines, birds with big outstretched wings, and interestingly, a bull-headed man.
Okay.
Now, those specific motifs aren't super common in earlier local Italic art, but you find very similar figures depicted in the decorative bands, the friezes, on Corinthian vases.
Which were being imported into Rome.
Exactly. They were widely traded. It looks like the Roman artisans were among the first to take those images directly from popular pottery designs and translate them into architectural sculpture on a large scale.
That's fascinating, taking inspiration from portable, everyday luxury items and putting it onto monumental buildings.
Yes. And we see similar mixing elsewhere, confirming this wasn't unique to Rome. Think of the famous temple plaque from Pergi, an Etruscan port.
The one with the Greek myth.
Right. It shows the seven against Thebes, a Greek story. The style is close to contemporary Greek sculpture, like from Aegina. But the object itself is a coloman plaque, a specifically central Italic architectural element. And the composition has links to Attic vase painting and Etruscan art.
So Greek myth, Greekish style, Italic function, maybe other influences. It's a total blend.
Exactly. This kind of creative synthesis was happening across the interconnected Mediterranean, and Rome, by the mid to late 6th century, was clearly right in the thick of it, producing sophisticated, internationally aware temple art.
It really paints Rome not as some isolated backwater, but as an active participant in these wider cultural currents. Okay, let's shift gears a bit to something that sounds, well, more solid, but also controversial. The city walls. What's the story there?
Ah, the walls. Yes, definitely complex and debated. One of the big problems is the material.
What material?
A local volcanic stone called Capellaccio tufa. It was readily available and used for construction over a long period.
Including later periods.
Yes. We know for sure it was used in the well-documented city walls built in the 4th century BCE, but it was also used earlier.
Hmm.
So just finding a wall made of Capellaccio doesn't automatically tell you if it's archaic or later. It makes dating really difficult.
So you can't just look at the stone and say, 6th century.
Unfortunately not. And then there's the debate about the extent of the early walls.
Whether they went all the way around.
Exactly. Did they form a complete, continuous circuit enclosing all the main hills right from the start? Or was it more piecemeal, strong, defensive stretches built on vulnerable points of the different hills, but not necessarily all joined up initially?
What does the evidence suggest?
There's evidence for archaic wall sections on the Quirinal, Esquiline, and Capitoline, but proving they all connected up into one single circuit in, say, the 6th century. That's still debated among scholars.
Okay, so uncertainty about the exact date and the complete circuit, but even if it wasn't fully joined up, the area they seem to have been trying to enclose or define, that was big, right?
But remarkably big.
Yeah.
Even if you only count the areas where we have decent evidence for early settlement and possible wall sections, you're looking at a minimum of 265 hectares.
Which is, how does that compare?
It's huge for central Italy at that time. No other city comes close. Veii, Rome's big rival, was large, but probably not that large in its defended area.
And if you include other hills, sometimes thought to be inside.
If you potentially include the Kilian and Aventine hills, the area might be as vast as 426 hectares. To find comparable protected areas in the Archaic period, you really have to look to the major cities in Sicily or the Greek East.
Wow. So even if the walls weren't finished, or maybe not even fully conceived as a single circuit yet, the ambition seems to have been enormous, defining a massive territory.
It suggests a surprisingly grand vision, a claim to a large space, even if much of it wasn't densely built up yet. It speaks volumes about early Roman self-perception and ambition.
Definitely. Okay, alongside walls, let's talk temples again. The big one. The Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline, a symbol of early Roman power. What do we know about its original form?
It's absolutely a key monument, and for its design, we're heavily reliant on a description by a Greek writer, Dionysius of Halicarnassus.
Who wrote much later, right? Isn't that a problem?
It can be a problem when Dionysius is describing events from centuries before his time, things that were ephemeral or poorly documented. But his description of the Temple of Jupiter is a bit different. Because the temple he was describing was, for the most part, still standing in his own lifetime, or just before it. He says it existed in the time of our fathers.
Ah, okay.
And we know from other Roman writers like Pliny and Cicero, and from archaeological clues, that the original archaic temple, dedicated traditionally in 509 or 507 BCE, survived largely intact until it burned down in 83 BCE.
So Dionysius, writing in the late 1st century BCE, could have seen it himself, or certainly spoken to people who had.
Exactly. So while it might have had repairs over the centuries, the basic 6th century structure was still there. Most scholars now accept his description as broadly reliable for the archaic plan.
And what did he describe?
He described a temple with 3 rows of 6 columns across the front, making a very deep porch, and then 3 parallel inner chambers, the cellae, for Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, flanked by outer colonnades. A classic Tuscan temple plan, but on a huge scale.
And the reconstructions based on this suggest it was massive for its time.
Absolutely enormous. The general consensus is that it was exceptionally large, not just by Roman or Italian standards, but compared to almost anything else being built in the Mediterranean world in the late 6th century BCE. Another sign of that remarkable Roman ambition.
So, grand temples. What about grand houses? Do we see evidence for elites building bigger homes, and how does that relate to how people were buried?
Yes, we start to see signs of more substantial housing appearing on the Capitoline, Palatine, Velia, and parts of the Esquiline during this period.
What kind of signs?
Sometimes it's structural remains, foundations suggesting larger buildings. Other times it's indirect, like wells filled with discarded pottery that seems a bit richer, or more imported goods hinting at more affluent households nearby. It suggests wealth inequality is growing, and an elite is investing in more impressive domestic spaces.
But you mentioned burials earlier. Was wealth always shown through houses?
That's where it gets interesting. On the eastern edges of the city, particularly the Esquiline and Quernal Hills, during the 7th and 6th centuries, increased wealth seems to show up more clearly in the graves than in the houses we've found so far.
So different ways of displaying status in different parts of town.
It seems possible. Now, finding archaic cemeteries in Rome is hard. Compared to Etruscan sites like Caere or Orvieto with their vast, well-preserved necropolis, Rome's early burial grounds were mostly built over later.
Right. Lost under the growing city.
But where we have found archaic graves, like on the Esquiline, they range from simple pits with basic local pottery, like impasto vases and maybe a fibula, a type of brooch.
More elaborate ones.
Yes. For the wealthier individuals, we find things like bronze chest plates, pectorals, ornate bronze boxes called cistae, imported jewelry, weapons like spears, definite signs of status differentiation in burial.
Okay, so varying expressions of wealth. Now, you mentioned earlier the sort of surge in building activity towards the end of the Archaic period, say around 540, 530 BCE.
Yes, the archaeology really points to a significant boom in monumental construction around then. What's striking is how little this construction pulse is reflected in the later Roman histories.
The texts don't talk about a building boom.
Not really, not in the way the archaeology suggests. They mention the Temple of Jupiter, of course, although who exactly commissioned it and when is debated, but they largely gloss over what seems to have been a period of widespread, intensive building activity.
That's a major disconnect. What kind of things were being built then that the texts miss?
Well, the archaeology suggests multiple substantial elite houses were going up. The first formal speaker's platform, the rostra, was built at the Comitium, the main public assembly space.
A key piece of civic infrastructure.
Absolutely. Also, the area Vesta, the precinct around the Sacred Hearth of Rome, seems to have been significantly reconstructed. We find evidence for new temples on the Palatine. And back at Santa Mabono, the sheer variety of terracotta roof decorations found suggests not just one temple, but maybe a whole complex, potentially 7 to 10 different roof systems, implying multiple sacred buildings.
Wow. Multiple houses, civic spaces, religious sites. That's a lot of activity to be mostly missing from the traditional story.
It is, and it's not just that the texts don't mention these specific projects. They also mention other projects, supposedly from this era, that we haven't found clear archaeological proof for yet.
Like what?
Things like the first phase of the Circus Maximus, the Temple of Diana on the Aventine, rows of shops in the Forum, temples to Fortuna, supposedly built by Servius Tullius. The textual tradition mentions these, but finding unambiguous 6th century remains for them has proven elusive so far.
It really highlights how partial both types of evidence, text and archaeology, can be, and how careful we need to be comparing them. Okay, so after this late 6th century boom, what happens as we transition into the early Republic, traditionally after 509 BCE? Does the pace keep up?
The evidence seems to suggest a bit of a slowdown in the number of new monumental projects, starting right in the early 5th century compared to the decades just before.
A lull after the boom.
Perhaps. But what's interesting is that the projects that were undertaken seem to get bigger. The scale increases.
Okay, so maybe fewer building sites, but the ones that were active were more ambitious.
That seems to be the picture. We see major temples being built or rebuilt then, like the Temple of Saturn at the foot of the Capitoline, and the huge temple of Castor and Pollux in the Forum. Also evidence for other early 5th century temples on the Capitoline and Velia.
Can you give a sense of that increased scale? You mentioned the Temple of Castor.
Yes, its podium alone was massive, around 5 meters high, and the temple platform was roughly 27.5 by maybe 37 to 40 meters. Building something like that required enormous resources, materials, labor. You could perhaps build 10 of the smaller archaic temples at Santo Mabono with the same effort.
That's a significant jump in scale. And what about Santo Mabono itself? What was happening there in the early 5th century?
Well, remember, we think there were twin temples there in the 6th century. The archaeology suggests the second of these was destroyed around 500 BCE. But then they were rebuilt, likely quite soon after, in the early 5th century.
How do we know it was soon after?
Because when archaeologists excavated the fill material used to construct the platform for the rebuilt temples, they found lots of 6th century material, but crucially, no material dating to the 5th century or later. That strongly implies the rebuilding happened early in the 5th century, before later pottery styles came into use.
Got it. And this period, early 5th century, also marks a shift in materials, right? More stone.
Yes. Generally across central Italy, around 500 or 490 BCE, we start seeing a move towards building temples more substantially out of stone, rather than relying quite so heavily on timber and terracotta for the main structure. And Rome, with projects like the Temple of Castor, was part of that trend.
Okay. So all this building activity, both the late 6th century boom and the large-scale early 5th century projects, it really makes you question the traditional narrative that pins almost everything on the last kings, the Tarquins, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Given how patchy and potentially biased the later stories about the kings are, the sheer amount and variety of monumental constructions suggested by the archaeology points to something broader.
Like not just top-down royal command.
Exactly. It suggests a more complex picture, perhaps involving broader elite competition, different families or groups sponsoring projects, a general societal dynamism investing in monumental display. Attributing everything significant solely to the Tarquins seems increasingly difficult to sustain based on the material evidence alone.
Right. It feels like the city itself, the community, or maybe multiple powerful groups within it were driving this transformation. Okay, let's try to wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground, from tiny post holes to massive temples. What are the key things you really want our listener to take away from this deep dive?
I think the main thing is that the archaeology, even though limited, shows us an archaic Rome that was far from isolated or primitive. It was a city undergoing dynamic urban growth.
Building infrastructure, defining its space.
Right. And it was deeply connected to the wider Mediterranean world,
Yeah.
actively participating in cultural exchange, adopting and adapting ideas in architecture and art.
And crucially, the material evidence, the stuff dug from the ground, gives us insights that don't always neatly match the later stories written down.
Exactly. It reveals a period of significant innovation, ambition, and a level of sophistication that the traditional narratives perhaps downplay or simplify.
And we always have to remember the caveats, right? The picture is incomplete because excavation is so difficult.
Absolutely. We have to be aware that our knowledge is skewed by where we can dig, and we need to let the objects and structures speak as much as possible, interpreting them in their regional and Mediterranean context, not just forcing them to fit later Roman legends.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you listening. Given this archaeological picture of early Rome, the scale of the walls, the sophistication of the temples, the international connections evident in the art, what else about early Roman society might we be underestimating?
If the buildings were this ambitious, what about their political structures, their social organization, their economic reach?
Exactly. How might looking harder at the material culture, the tangible remains, give us a richer, maybe more surprising view of how Rome truly began, beyond those familiar, perhaps too simple, legends?